Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here today. I forget if we mentioned this yesterday, but it doesn't matter. It's worth sharing again, even if we did. There was a 90-year-old COVID patient in Belgium, and doctors were about to put her on a ventilator, and she said no. She told the doctor, she said, I don't want it. Save it for younger patients. I already had a good life. And she passed away 2 days later. And there's going to be a lot of other selfless acts like that, but as you think of that story and other stories that you're going to be hearing more and more of, one of the hardest parts of this whole thing is that everyone who has COVID fights it alone in the hospital and dies alone in the hospital. So doctors and nurses are in this position to not only provide medical care, but also they're truly the last people that a patient might see and interact with in this world, which is an extra emotional burden on top of our doctors and nurses as well. Something to think about. We're going to talk with Ralph Reed coming up here in a little bit. I'm excited about that. We got a doctor coming up next too. And we got our big special tomorrow as well with a lot of great guests. But I just got a couple random things I want to talk about here. We'll start off with. So real quick, yesterday we did a whole segment on the government tracking your location and then cross-referencing that with the COVID test results. So we did that segment yesterday, and then sure enough, just right after the show, a big article that in England, government set to release a contact tracking app which detects nearby virus carriers. So, and the same thing as we said, it's gonna start out as an opt-in, but I imagine it's gonna be required by most employers, right? So it's gonna track your location using a GPS, but then also your precise location using Bluetooth to see who you're really close to. So the satellites will know that you're at the restaurant, but then the Bluetooth will know who you're sitting next to at the restaurant. And then if someone gets COVID, you'll get an alert about it and say, hey, 2 days ago you were at this restaurant, your server had COVID, and take, now you're quarantined. So I mean, we said it's not even a difficult hurt. It's not like an engine. They already know. Google knows everywhere you ever are and go and have ever been in the last 10 years. So this isn't a difficult engineering challenge. They just have to do it. And here they're doing it in England, and I'm sure they'll do it here very soon too. So get prepared for that. Will you opt in? Would you opt in? A couple days ago, last week, I think, we quoted Bill Gates. And someone wrote me a note and they said, Slater, why are you listening to Bill Gates? As if he's just a big dummy head, was the way this person said that. So first of all, he's a pretty smart guy. We'll start there. Maybe more importantly, he's an influential guy. So politicians are going to listen to him. And I want to try to get as much insight as to what's coming. So I'm going to listen to what Bill Gates is telling politicians who we're at the whim of, for the most part. Here. Also, Bill Gates has been studying diseases for decades now. He gave a TED Talk in 2015 about how we need to prepare for a pandemic. So he's ahead of pretty much everyone on this stuff here. So he says there's 3 steps. I want to go over these real quick because, again, this is what's coming. He says, first, we need a consistent nationwide approach to shutting down. Bill Gates is big on this. I hear people like Dr. Gottlieb and others talk about how we can do a piecemeal, either state or regional approach. But you have someone like Bill Gates who says, no, it's all or nothing. He says, despite urging from public health experts, some states and counties haven't shut down completely. Florida just did yesterday? Tennessee just did yesterday, the other day. In some states, this is a recipe for disaster because people can travel freely across state lines, so can the virus. The country's leaders need to be clear. Shut down anywhere means shut down everywhere. Until the case numbers start to go down across America, which could take 10 weeks or more. Do you remember a while back when people thought it would be a week? Remember that? Remember when people thought, 2 weeks, we'll be back to work in 2 weeks, no problem. I remember I had certain speeches planned and different events and meetings and trips and whatever. And people were like, hey, let's just cancel. We'll schedule it for the end of the month. 10 weeks, at least 10 weeks. No one can continue business as usual or relax the shutdown. Any confusion about this point will only extend the economic pain, raise the odds that the virus will return, and cause more deaths. So you have an influential people talking about how it's got to be nationwide. And we're not really doing that yet. So we'll see how the next couple of days and weeks go if that's ever going to be a thing that's implemented next. There's still a lot of tools that the government has in their toolbox that they haven't used yet. We'll see if they need to. Second thing he talks about is massive testing, but he wrote about all the challenges that we've talked about these last few weeks when it comes to testing. Not only do you have to come up with the test, but then you need to figure out how to mass produce it. You need to be able to distribute it. You need to be able to get the results back quickly. He talked about how there's a backlog currently of analyzing the tests of up to 7 or 10 days in some places, and we need results in less than 24 hours. Like, what's the point if you go take a test and you don't get the results back in a week? So we still have some major problems there with the testing, and we've got to figure that out if we ever want to get back to a somewhat normal life, especially because you know all the science of this now, that you can spread the disease even if you don't know you have the symptoms, or if you don't have any symptoms. Third thing, this is what I think is maybe most fascinating. He's talking about the vaccine. And this is what he says. He says, to bring the disease to an end, we need a safe and effective vaccine. If we do everything right, we could have one in less than 18 months. If we have time today, I don't think we will. Then we get the special tomorrow. But on Monday, I want to talk about the vaccine process. If it's less than 2 years, it'll be a miracle. Nothing like that's ever happened. But anyway, he says we could have one in 18 months. But it's about the fastest a vaccine has ever been developed. It takes usually about 10 to 15 years to make a vaccine. But creating a vaccine is only half the battle. To protect Americans and people around the world, we'll need to manufacture billions of doses. Billions. It's the same thing we've been talking about here. So this is what he says, and this is an interesting thing I've never heard of before, never thought of before. He says we need to build factories now. We got to start building the factories to make the vaccines now, so when the vaccine's ready, we can just hit the ground running. Now, here's what's interesting about this. He says because many of the top candidates are made for vaccines are made using unique equipment, we'll have to build facilities for each of them, knowing that they won't get used. Private companies can't take that kind of risk. The federal government can. Apparently, the federal government's made a deal with at least 2 companies to prepare for vaccine manufacturing. I hope more deals will follow. So, right, think about that. So we'll have to build, let's say there's 5 major vaccine candidates out there. I'm making that up, right? But we'll have to build, because there's actually 26 different tests that are going on right now to get a vaccine, 26 in different stages of development. But let's say there's 5 that kind of, work their way to the end. We'll have to build 5 factories, and then in the end, use only one of them. And we have to do that, because if we don't, that could put us many more months behind, right? Because then you get the vaccine, and then it's like, oh, well, now we got to build a factory, and now we got to get these machines, and now we got to retool this, retool that, create this, and it's going to take many more months. So we got to build, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates' point is we got to build 5 of them now so that we're ready. Never thought of that. I want to make one last point. So there you go, right? So it's Bill Gates. We got to do it nationwide. We need to start building vaccine stuff now, and we need way, 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 way more testing, which we're not even close to doing yet. He has another line here that I skipped over. He says, without a vaccine, developing countries are at an even greater risk than the wealthy ones because it's even harder for them to do physical distancing and shutdowns. I want to talk more about second and third world countries moving forward, because no one else is. And if you think things are bad in New York, what do you think is going to happen in India? So I wanted to pay more attention to this because it's going to be just devastating, right? So some perspective here. Liberia, they have a population about the size of Louisiana. Louisiana, by the way, is in pretty bad shape. It's projected, whatever these projections are worth, we do all this modeling. We put asterisks with every time we talk about projections. But the projection for Louisiana is they'll need 1,211 ICU beds, and they only have 477. So they have about a 700 ICU bed shortage potentially in Louisiana. But I bring this up because they have 1,000 ventilators in Louisiana. Liberia, which has the same population of Louisiana, they have 3. Not 3,000. 3. Louisiana has 1,000. Liberia has 3. So anyone in Liberia who gets this and needs a ventilator will die, except for 3 people, the 3 lucky people who get it. I don't think it's a stretch to say, if we're talking 100 to 200,000 deaths in America, is it a stretch to say 1 million deaths in Africa and India and countries like that? We have 1 ICU bed in America. We have 1 ICU bed for every 2,800 people. Uganda has 1 ICU bed for every 1 million people. The largest slum in Mumbai, the density of that area, take Manhattan which is by far the most population dense place in America. It's like not even close. Not even close. You take Manhattan and replace every person with 13, and you have the same population density. So if there's anyone here listening in New York and you're getting a little claustrophobic, right, and you're finding it hard to maintain your social distance, imagine every person you see, there being 13 people there. And then let's talk about keeping our 6 feet distance. And you could live in parts of India and never in your entire life be more than 6 feet away from someone, right? You know, or like you never, like 6 feet is, you're always within 6 feet of someone forever. They are, we're buying hand sanitizer here in America. We're hoarding hand sanitizer. They have no hand sanitizer in India. They have no running water in some of these places. So you think third world countries, and then you think, what are they going to be doing in refugee camps? The first known case was yesterday, 2 days ago, at a refugee camp in Greece. I'm just going to sweep through those camps. Tijuana, we're close to Tijuana. I live here in San Diego. You think about what's going to happen when it just rips through Tijuana. Homeless encampments in America, like Skid Row, like what the heck's going to happen there? And another problem with these countries, we can't help them. We got our own problems. We can't send the USNS Comfort to Africa because it's in New York City. We can't send the Mercy to India. It's in Los Angeles. Who's going to help them? You don't even have the EU helping Italy. Do you think the UN is going to go help Africa? But you know who's going to claim to? China. We'll save this one for another day, but China's trying to do this whole goodwill mission to the world by, if it wasn't for us, then you wouldn't have these masks and you wouldn't have these tests and you wouldn't have the thermometers. And we know how to stop it. And they're leveraging a lot of their media in Africa because as we talked about before, our special a couple weeks ago against China, or about China, telling how they're our enemy, they're spending a ton of money in Africa. And part of that now is to leverage that with the media to write these glowing stories about how China's saving the world from COVID. But you're going to have third world snake oil salesmen in the midst of this as well. So right now, the president of Madagascar said that he found a cure for COVID. And then I made the president of little old Madagascar. He found, that's great. That's fantastic news. Hopefully one day he can share it with the world and we can all have that cure. Thank you, president of Madagascar. But you're going to have all the snake oil salesmen. A couple years back, I think it was the year 2000, the president of Gambia said he found a cure for AIDS. And it turned out to be some mixture of herbs and bananas mixed together. Now, there are a couple of things about this cure. It only worked on Thursdays and Mondays. And just a little side note, if you criticized him about it, then they throw you in jail. So we know that he treated 9,000 people and part of the deal was you couldn't get any other type of treatment. You just had to do the president's treatment. And then, so 9,000 people did it, and I'm sure almost 9,000 people died from it. So you're gonna get a lot of that in these African countries as well. That's gonna make things way, way, way worse. So I just wanna throw that your way. I'm just gonna have friendly reminders every once in a while when we see how bad things are in New York City. Think about how bad things are gonna get in Mexico. And there's another thing no one's talking about. Like, let's say we get out of the woods here in America, we got the busiest border crossing in the world. COVID's just gonna rip through the Mexican border towns, and then we're still gonna have open borders with Mexico? That seems like something we should figure out now. But anyway, if you look at how bad it's going on in New York City, think about how bad it's going in third world countries. Okay, we'll take a break. We got Ralph Reed coming up from the Christian Coalition, and we got a doctor we're gonna talk to next and get some more insight. Masks, no masks, no one knows. We'll get some more insight there as well. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Slater Crusaders, I want to get as much wisdom and insight about what's going on as possible because it's changing every single day, and we've gone from knowing absolutely nothing to knowing just a tiny bit more than absolutely nothing, but even that tiny bit can make such a big difference. So I'm grateful to talk to Dr. Ruben Elevitz. He's a doctor of internal medicine at Private Health Dallas. Dr. Ruben, Dr. Elevitz, sorry, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me today.
Good, I'm glad you're here. Let's start with the big question that no one can answer. Mask or no mask? Should people wear masks when they walk around outside, go to the grocery store, et cetera?
I think for right now, until there's a surplus of masks that are available, it's not something I recommend to my own personal clients. I think if for some reason they have them in their masks that cannot be utilized by frontline healthcare workers, most of the hospitals are, at least where I live in Dallas, and most of the hospitals are still requesting that people that have either had their own supplies donate them to the hospital. So there are healthcare workers, EMS or emergency medical techs have masks. So currently I don't. I think with what the CDC's position is, I wouldn't be surprised if you think about anyone who's caring for someone who's sick is currently the recommendation. And if you were sick yourself, there seems to be no reason why there any downside to wearing a mask. And ultimately, I think it'll be preventative, especially if we're going to have, whether it's 5, 10, 15, 20% of people that are asymptomatic spreading disease. It's going to be, hypothetically, it should make sense that people should be wearing masks. But I think first things is the doctors and the nurses and the healthcare workers need to have enough masks first.
Okay, so no masks now until we make enough of them, like the MyPillow guy or whatever is knocking out 50,000 a day. So until we get enough of them, and then we should wear them. Or unless you're sick right now, or potentially sick, or caring for someone who's sick, then you should try to wear one. Is it worth wearing like a bandana or something?
You know, the downside to any of those things is then you're contaminating. Most people don't know how to, even if you were to wear a mask, most people don't know how to wear a mask correctly because they're either going to be touching their face, touching the mask, and then when they're taking it off, they're not doing it correctly. And they use that in place of washing their hands. So, you know, whether you use a scarf or bandana, I think for those that are sick, if they, the first thing would be is for them to just stay home. But assuming that someone has to go out, or I would say probably a scarf or bandana is probably better than nothing.
But don't get a false confidence about it.
I'm not confident in using that, no.
Yeah, okay. What is something about the disease that you've seen so far that we'll start with bad, I guess. So we'll do most concerning or most alarming when it comes to COVID?
I think with how rapidly it has spread in certain areas, and with our current understanding is why in certain areas, not only in the United States, obviously, but even around the world, if you look at even the European countries, you can see pretty dramatic differences in countries that are side by side with dramatic differences in the number of cases, and whether or not that's all due to the way it's tested. You know, one of the things we were all told is, at least from a public perspective, is when it came to the United States, is if you look at New York as an example, as you increase the number of tests, especially for those that are being tested that are asymptomatic, the assumption would be is that the case fatality rates would go down. And that's actually not happened in the most important city right now, New York, and their case fatality rates have actually continued to climb, which is worrisome.
Yeah, give us, okay, so rate of spread, give us maybe some promising news or something about it that should maybe make us fear or worry a little less than we might be.
You know, at some point, even you take New York City, there's a significant number of people who are recovered. If you take the majority of the population that is younger and healthier, even if they are to get it, in the grand scheme of things, they're most likely, if you look at the percentages, 80+% should recover without really having to be in a hospital and are going to have mild cases. And the numbers of patients who have recovered is a significant number and will continue to grow. And as that percentage of the population increases, even in those that don't ever have symptoms or that are asymptomatic and recovered, those people will be able to go back to work. And figuring out how we're able to allow a percentage of the population to go back to work safely and to protect those that are most vulnerable is, I think it's a question of how and when. But I do think that is going to become a realistic possibility other than just shutting everything down indefinitely.
Yeah, until we have a vaccine. Yeah, that's right. How though is going to be very interesting. We kicked off the show talking about Bill Gates, and he said we need a nationwide lockdown. It's got to be everywhere or nowhere. I mean, you just talked about how it's interesting how it's some regions or some countries it's more or it's worse or not as much. So are you of the school of thought that we need maybe perhaps a more nationwide shutdown? Or I know Dr. Gottlieb and others have talked about how you can do it state by state or regionally. What do you think?
I think right now the amount of information that's coming out from the political environment is too confusing. You know, if you've got one county judge saying one thing and then a governor saying one thing, and then you've got the president saying one thing and then medical experts, I think there's too much information out there that's confusing to the general public. I don't think there's any question at this point by almost every model you look at. There should be a national lockdown. What's legal, what's not. I'm not a judge or an attorney,
Sure.
so I don't know how that works. But I don't think there's any question at this point there should be some degree of national lockdown. And I think as the things move forward, you know, if things were to continue the way that they have in New York, at some point you have to look at those that are most vulnerable, which is our parents, our grandparents, those that are over 65, those with chronic medical conditions. And those patients should be, as far as I'm concerned, should be locked down as well. And until there's some degree of the younger population has been able to, even once we are able to go back to work, or people are allowed to go back to work even for the non-essential purposes, I think it's probably safer for the younger population to at least be the ones who are going to be exposed or getting sick, so that when the beds are needed at some point, then we'll be able to do that on a more controlled basis for those that are the sickest and likely to be in trouble.
Can you give us some insight into some of the stresses that doctors are going through right now? All doctors, but particularly those, you know, working in the ER and the ICU. I'm not one, so I can't fathom what they're experiencing, but can you give us some insight into that?
Sure. You know, I'm not in the emergency room or on the front lines myself, but I've spoken with my colleagues that are, and even from watching what's happening in New York, you know, when you see the number one, even if you're not there and you see the death tolls in New York in Italy from the number of physicians who passed away, that doesn't even take into account nurses, other healthcare workers. But when you're dealing with high volumes of patients that are critically ill, that have a disease that you have very little control over how to treat them other than just to try and be supportive, it's very discouraging when you're seeing them die and you can't do much. You know, obviously we're trained to think of the worst things and to treat the worst things and to keep people alive. But when you're having to watch people die, whether it's on a ventilator or without a ventilator, and when they're having to die without being able to talk to their family members or have any family members with them, it's got to be in certain areas very demoralizing for the healthcare team, especially for those that don't have the appropriate coverage, whether it's, you know, their hospital isn't providing it, whether the government hasn't provided it, or whoever. It's got to be very frustrating, especially for those that are seeing their colleagues sick, especially if
So, sorry to interrupt. It must be hard for doctors too to keep your humanity in the midst. Well, anytime, right? But when you have so much happening and you have so many people and it's rush, like how do you even find the time to slow down and talk and be with an individual patient as a human? That's got to be very difficult. Sorry, I got about 30 seconds. Please you answer that question if you'd like, if you have any thoughts there. But also, just one last thought, something that you think no one's talking about that you want to yell from the rooftops.
I would say probably the most important thing that I would say from an optimistic standpoint is that there is an escalation of the amount of the testing that is going to be available, not only for the virus itself, which is primarily for those that are in the general public, for, you know, the PCR-based testing that is either going to be the nasal swabs and other options. But along with that is all the companies that have come forward to be able to do the antibody testing. So we are really going to be able to have much more access to know who has had the virus, who has the virus, and then also who has been exposed and recovered, which is going to be very helpful moving forward to decide how we put people back to work, allow the country to open back up, et cetera.
Yeah, the antibody test is essential. Real quick, do you have any last thoughts on advice on how doctors keep their humanity in the midst of it?
You know, I think at the end of the day, it's very hard. With the physicians as a whole, we all struggle with balance and being able to find a way when they do get home to disconnect. and to be able to spend time with their family, their children, colleagues, outside of that environment to try and be able to disconnect from what they're experiencing in the hospital. But for most physicians that are on the front lines, I imagine that is going to be extremely difficult.
Dr. Ruben Elevitz from Private Health Dallas. Sir, keep in touch, and hopefully things don't get as bad in Dallas and Texas as they are in New York right now. But let's stay in touch.
Take care. Stay well. Stay healthy.
Thank you. Yeah, please, and give our best to all the doctors who are there in the hospital. We're thinking of them, obviously. Thank you, doctor. Coming up next, we're going to talk with Dr. Ralph Reed. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, what an honor to talk to our next guest, Dr. Ralph Reed. He's the chairman of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. He's got a new book, For God and Country, The Christian Case for Trump, which came out just 2 days ago, which is either the best time for a new book to come out or the absolute worst time for a new book to come out. Dr. Reed, how are you, sir?
I'm good, Mike. Good to be with you.
Is it a good time? I think it's a good, people maybe have more time to read, but it's hard to break through and get attention out there. But I'm grateful that we could do this.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, obviously, we didn't know when we timed the publication, that we'd be dealing with the coronavirus. But I have had people tell me, hey, I need something to read, and it's doing well on Amazon. So I think it's all for the good.
Well, good. Let's sell some more. So before we get to the book, I just want to get your thoughts on just the whole COVID thing in general, and if you think, or let me ask this way: what's been on your heart recently when it comes to this situation?
Well, obviously, like everybody else, you're concerned about your own family and your loved ones. I have 4 adult children, and they've been impacted by this. Their offices are closed. They're either working from home or they're furloughed. The most important thing, of course, as important as the economy is people's health, that they stay safe. And I think the president has done an extraordinary job under very difficult circumstances. I think Vice President Pence is doing an incredible job as the head of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. And these have been very difficult decisions by government officials, by public health officials. But this is a very dangerous public health crisis. It's the worst global pandemic in over a century. And let's just hope that these public mitigation and social distancing guidelines do the trick that we hope they will do by mitigating the spread and ultimately reducing the number of infections and deaths.
Do you think one thing that could come out of this for the better is perhaps a bit of spiritual awakening, perhaps people looking to God more than they were last month?
I don't think there's any question about that. I think that, without pointing fingers at anybody else, I can say this as much for myself as anyone else. All of us have a tendency to develop our identity and our worth and our significance and our meaning in life from, our career, our jobs, our 401k or investment accounts. And the economy was roaring, just 2 months ago, just 6 weeks ago. So to have all of that kicked away, and at a time of great economic insecurity, great social ferment, people tend to turn to faith in even larger numbers. Some of this is anecdotal, but we know, for example, that at First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, that the number of people who are live streaming their Sunday worship services has gone from 50,000 before the crisis to 200,000. Free Chapel, which is a multi-denominational church, a multi-campus, non-denominational church outside Atlanta, has gone from about 500,000 to 1.5 million people accessing their services. So there's clearly a spiritual hunger, and the irony, we would not have wished for this, of course, but the irony of all this, and maybe the silver lining, is that there may be more people being exposed to the gospel and to a message of hope and redemption in the midst of this crisis and calamity than at any other time in the history of our country.
So if someone were to tune into a service or want to get closer to God during this time, what message do you hope they see and come across? There's a lot, obviously, but what's the most important message you think people are hungry for?
I think the message that is emanating from America's pulpits and on these, not just the worship services, but Bible studies and discipleship groups and others, is, God is not sitting on the throne in heaven looking down at this, rubbing his hands together, trying to figure out what to do. He's sovereign. He's in charge. He cares about us. He loves us. He's the great physician. And I think what we can do is we can let people know, first of all, that God loves them, that he cares about them, that he has a plan for them, and that good will come out of this. It's very hard in the midst of a calamity like this when you're dealing with disease and death and loss and insecurity to see the good that will come out of it. But if people build their life on a foundation of faith rather than on a foundation of things that we now know, we knew this before, but we've been dramatically reminded that the world can change in an instant. All the things that you believe are the basis of your security, your income, your job, your investments, your savings, can be gone in the blink of an eye. And to be reminded of that forces us to build our lives on a foundation that is more permanent, more reliable, and is eternal and transcendent. And, ultimately, what I believe as a Christian is that this world and all that is in it is passing away. When it passes away, we don't know. That's not for us to know. But we're only here for a while. And eternity is about something much more significant. And again, I regret every single loss, every sick person. I would not have wished this on anybody. But if that good comes out of it, then it will not have been for naught.
Yeah, amen to all that. I read a tweet the other day. It said, what were we even talking about last month? But I also think about that just more than just what we were talking about. What were we thinking about last month? What were we having our identity consumed by last month? What were we most focused on last month versus right now? And I hope for people they're very different things. Because we obviously, I think it's really, I don't want to say it's hard. Help me word this sentence better, Doctor. I was going to say something like, it's hard to be a Christian in America. That's not quite right, but it's hard to stay focused on God in America. We almost have it too good. And it's too easy to be distracted. So, I don't know. Let me ask it this way. You can comment on that, but also, what role can Christians play through this to help this broken world? And first of all, to help other Christians, but also to help other people who are suffering through it.
Well, the good news is, the church is adapting and innovating in the midst of this crisis. And I've got an op-ed that's going to be coming out in the Wall Street Journal next week in which I talk about this. I've alluded to it a little bit in this interview. Ministries have had to shift from physical spaces to virtual platforms. So you've got live streaming of church services, you've got support groups and discipleship groups and Bible studies that are meeting on Zoom. You've got Bible lessons that are being conducted on Facebook and Twitter. The point is that the hunger and the almost primordial yearning that human beings have to worship, to serve, and to know God is unquenchable. It cannot be extinguished. And in fact, there's a lot of data to argue that it's deepened and brought into fuller relief in the midst of a crisis. So that's number one. The church has got to flood this zone. Christians and the armies of compassion, fired by faith in him and a desire to share his love and mercy for all, can't hibernate and take a nap and curl up in a fetal position in the midst of this. They've got to be like warriors who are flooding a war zone. And I think the second thing is to, in a tangible way, put hands and feet to our prayers and to demonstrate in real ways our love for other people. And I think you see that in, we don't know, but obviously a lot of these healthcare workers are believers. And the work that they're doing in these emergency rooms and hospitals and clinics is a form of ministry. You look at Samaritan's Purse building the field hospital in Central Park. You look at churches like Prestonwood in Plano, Texas, that are feeding people and providing meals and care. And this doesn't get commented on a lot, Mike, by the dominant mainstream media. But the leading nonprofit in most urban centers that are providing social services right now to those who are either homeless or have been unemployed by this is the Salvation Army. So the church can shine at a moment like this. And I think that would be not just my counsel to Christians. I think it's my observation of what they're doing. And I applaud the church for doing so.
I love this line, Christians have to flood this zone. I think that's really good. And the point about Zoom, I've been on this Bible study as men's group for 9 years, and obviously we're doing it over Zoom now, but it's been awesome because a lot of the guys who have moved away and moved around the world, been deployed around the world, whatever, have been able to join in now, and it's actually been that much more encouraging. One last point, and you may be able to speak on this better, and it's been a little bit since I've read Screwtape Letters, but I remember one of the early letters, Screwtape told his nephew, or like the nephew was excited because bad things were going to happen to the guy, his patient. But Screwtape it was something like, no, you don't really want bad things to happen because then he might come closer to God. You want to keep him bored. You want to keep him like bored and prosperous and distracted. That's the most important thing. Because then God can use the bad thing. We don't want that. It was something like that. That's a bad paraphrase of C.S. Lewis. But I think this is an opportunity for us to flood this zone. That's my long way of saying that. Dr. Reed, can we take a quick break? We'll come back. We'll talk about the book.
Sure.
Yeah, the book's called For God and Country, The Christian Case for Trump. Dr. Ralph Reed. We'll talk more with the doctor coming up. Spread the word. Slater Crusaders, super grateful for our guest being able to stick around, and honored to talk to him at all, let alone for 2 segments. But Dr. Ralph Reed, his new book, For God and Country, The Christian Case for Trump, just came out 2 days ago. Buy it on Amazon. Doctor, this is a really interesting situation with this president that historians will be talking about for a long time. Because there's an argument to be made that how could a Christian support this president, a man who's been divorced and blah, 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 all these different things. So let me ask it this way. We'll start with this way. Can a Christian support a sinner as president?
Well, the Bible teaches that we're all sinners saved by grace. And my argument is not that Donald Trump is without sin, because we're all sinners. And we all fall short and we all make mistakes. And my argument is not that he's perfect, because we're all imperfect. We're all under his grace. But my argument is that for all of his foibles, flaws, and imperfections, and it was not an easy sell, by the way. And this is what the book is really about. How is it that Donald Trump, a thrice married Manhattan billionaire who owned casinos, and had been tabloid fodder for decades, with a life that did not reflect the biblical principles of many believers. How is it that he won the highest share of the vote of evangelical Christians and pro-family, mass-attending Catholics in American history? And the answer, and there's a lot to that story, by the way, including how I got to meet him and know him in 2010 and 2011. I got to know him as a private citizen. We became friends. I had many conversations with him, and there's a lot of that in the book. A lot of behind-the-scenes stories of how this happened. But for the people who didn't get a chance to know him the way I was privileged to, it really boiled down to the fact that on the issues and the values that beat in the heart and give meaning to the souls of tens of millions of Americans. The sanctity of life, religious freedom, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the right to share the gospel without fear of persecution or restrictions, support for the state of Israel. On those things, Donald Trump was not only good, but he has turned out to be a champion. And, I talk in the book about the fact that he may not have won, Mike. We'll never know. It's what historians call a counterfactual.
Yep.
He may not have won if there hadn't been a vacancy on the Supreme Court, with a court that was evenly divided, 4 liberals, 4 conservatives, because at that point, whatever you thought of Donald Trump, it was either going to be him or Hillary making that and probably multiple other appointments with massive long-term implications for religious freedom, the abortion issue, and many others. So that's how it happened. And, I would argue, and I've got a chapter in the book on this, you can attack Donald Trump's character. Does he say or do things sometimes that I wish he wouldn't say or do? Yeah, he does. And there's an occasional tweet that I wish he hadn't sent. My guess is there are a few that he regrets. But on the big issues, growing the economy, criminal justice reform, standing up for life, he made certain promises. He's kept those promises. And I think Christians were not only justified in supporting him, I think it was a morally correct thing to do.
Based off of your knowledge and interactions you've had with him, do you think he supported and supports these things for pragmatic reasons because he knows he is the alternative to Hillary and to the Democrat? Or do you think he truly believes in these things?
It's a great question. And it's one that I actually address in the book. And the point that I make is, that, first of all, my relationship with him, although he's a friend, and, obviously I interact with him as president. But my relationship with him is not as a pastor, priest, rabbi, or spiritual counselor. That's not the nature of our relationship or our conversations. I can tell you that I do know other people who have that kind of relationship who say that he has a genuine faith. I can also tell you that the vice president has said, not just to me, but has publicly said that he and the president pray together. Here's the way I would say it, and I would actually not particularize this to Donald Trump. I think we are all complex creatures with multivariated motives. I think some are pure and some are not. Some are selfish and ambitious and egotistical, and some are compassionate and empathetic. And I think whether Donald Trump came to these positions because he believed they served him politically or because he believed it was the right thing to do, and probably like most politicians, it's an admixture. The point is, he's done the right thing. Presidents for 25 years promised to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It was actually a U.S. law that they do so. He was the first to do it. Previous presidents said they would defund Planned Parenthood. Donald Trump promulgated regulations that actually did it. So for people who believe in those things and believe that those are intrinsically good objectives, it's not about whether he's going to heaven or not. That's ultimately going to be decided by the good Lord. It's whether or not he resists evil and advances intrinsic goods. And let me just give one more example. Criminal justice reform, which is one of my organization, Faith and Freedom Coalition's top objectives. We started working on this issue in 2013. We worked with Barack Obama on it. We've worked with people like Dick Durbin and others on a bipartisan basis. It never got done until Donald Trump got involved. Now, whatever you think of him politically or personally, The fact is, there are tens of thousands of people in prison today who are either enrolled in high school equivalency, chemical dependency programs, and are getting early release for good behavior because of what he did. And that's what I talk about in God and Country. I tell the story of how that happened.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I had this flashback to Barack Obama's reelection. I remember all these news people would go and interview people who are going to vote for him or beforehand, and they'd say, so what was, why are you voting for him again? Like, what are some of your favorite accomplishments of his? And no one could name anything. Right? I was like, I don't, But if you asked a Christian who's paying half attention to this, and you ask them what you're voting for President Trump again, they should be able to rattle off a dozen things that you just mentioned of really impressive accomplishments that have happened. We only got a couple minutes, sir. What is an interaction you had with the president that was encouraging for you, or something, an interesting story that we should know about?
Well, there are many. I think the one that sort of, jumps out at me is when a group of us were in the Oval Office shortly after he made the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem. And he said, when the word began to seep out that I was about to make this decision, and he pointed to the phone on the Resolute desk, he said that phone started ringing off the hook with virtually every major leader in Europe and the Middle East trying to talk me out of it. Wow. And he said, I didn't take a single one of their calls. He said, I wouldn't take their call because I knew what they were calling about. He said, so then what they started doing was they started calling, at that time, it was H.R. Master, who was the National Security Advisor. They started calling McMaster. They started calling Pence. Don't let him do this. Don't let him do this. And, everybody said that the world would come to an end and the Middle East would explode in an unprecedented conflagration, if the president moved the embassy. And, it didn't happen. And it was just another example, like the Supreme Court picks, where he made a promise, he gave his word, and it was very clear to me, Mike, in that conversation, and I think it's revealing of his character. I genuinely do. Set politics aside, it was impressive that to him, keeping his word was important. Not saying he always did it in his whole life, or that any of us have. But in that case, after so many decades of politicians promising one thing and then doing something else and treating their campaign rhetoric as if it was just a way to get votes, to him, it was like, I said I was going to do this, and I'm going to do it. And it was very impressive.
Yeah, wow, I look forward to hearing many more stories like that of your involvement and your personal interaction with the president. For God and Country, The Christian Case for Trump just came out like 2 days ago, so go buy it on Amazon. Ralph Reed Jr. Dr. Reed, thanks for your time, sir.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate what you do.
Thanks for all the work you're doing. Yeah, thank you. Hope we can talk again. Slater Crusaders, appreciate you. Tomorrow we got our latest COVID special. 2 guests in particular that I'm looking forward to talking to. We're going to talk with a trucker who's keeping this country moving, and we're going to talk to someone who owns a supply manufacturing company that helps make the things that are essential that we all need during this. These are some behind-the-scenes unsung heroes that we're going to talk to on tomorrow's special. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word.